On a heavy, airless August afternoon in the summer of 1897, when the heat itself seemed to shimmer, like a fever over the rooftops of Fort Wayne, Indiana, a sudden fire broke out inside the east wing of the Grand Crane Mansion. Servants ran through the smoke-choked corridors, their arms full of silver trays and gilded picture frames, desperate to rescue anything that might be spared from the flames. In that frantic haze of heat and panic, one young servant, his shirt clinging damp to his skin, stumbled against what looked to be an ordinary bookshelf. But the shelf shifted. Behind it lay a narrow, dust-choked cavity, and in that hidden compartment rested a single leather-bound ledger, its cover scorched at the edges but miraculously intact. Inside, the servant later said the pages were dense with neat, unwavering handwriting, arranged in 3 stark columns. The first listed more than 400 names, men, women, and children, all from the surrounding counties. The second noted dates of what the writer chillingly called acquisition. And the third recorded their final dates beside a single cold word processed. The servant would later claim that the book carried a faint metallic odor, sharp and acrid, like the iron tang of the steel foundries along the river. Local authorities were summoned at once. The ledger was seized. The discovery briefly whispered about in the smoke-filled parlors of Fort Wayne's elite, and then just as swiftly the matter disappeared. Within days, the fire was declared an unfortunate accident. The investigation closed without explanation. And for 3 long years, the truth of what lay behind those names remained buried, sealed beneath the thick walls of wealth, influence, and fear. Who had written it? What did the word processed really mean? And why did the cities so eager for progress seem just as eager to forget? To understand, we must step back into the age that gave birth to both unimaginable wealth and unspeakable appetites. The story that follows is not merely a family chronicle, but a slow descent into the hidden chambers of the Gilded Age, a place where fortunes glittered like sunlight on polished steel, while shadows pooled deeper than anyone dared admit. Fort Wayne in the 1880s was drunk on its own future. Steam engines screamed across the railroad yards day and night, hauling coal and iron to feed the furnaces of industry. At the beating heart of this transformation stood the Crane Steel Works, a sprawling complex of smoke and fire that employed nearly 3,000 men and produced some of the finest steel west of Pittsburgh. The empire belonged to one man, Bartholomew Crane, though some whispered his birth name had not been Crane at all. Bartholomew towered at 6 feet 3, with eyes as pale and piercing as frozen water and a mane of prematurely silver hair that only sharpened his aristocratic bearing. He had been born to a modest Ohio farm family, but through sheer relentless will, he forged himself into one of the wealthiest men in the Midwest. By the age of 38, in the year 1885, he controlled not only the steelworks but also vast tracts of farmland, 3 smaller factories and a railroad line, linking Fort Wayne directly to Chicago. His fortune exceeded $2 million, an almost mythical sum, for the time placing him firmly among the industrial royalty of America's Gilded Generation. But it was not merely his wealth that made Bartholomew Crane a subject of endless fascination. It was the strange, almost theatrical way he chose to build his family. Unlike the secretive polygamists of the Utah territories, Crane made no effort to cloak his arrangements in shadow. He called it his extended family, and he spoke of it with the same calm authority he used to discuss steel production. At the center of this grand experiment stood Crane Manor, a 40-room Gothic revival palace that loomed over the Maumee River, its towers seeming to scrape the pale Indiana sky. Within its echoing halls lived what locals came to call the primary family, 7 wives and 23 children, all sharing the same roof in what appeared, at least to outside eyes, to be an atmosphere of careful harmony. Each wife was granted her own wing of the mansion, complete with private sitting rooms and nurseries, and each signed a spiritual matrimony contract that promised financial security and legal protection in exchange for absolute devotion to the family unit. Servants and tutors drifted silently through the corridors, ensuring that Crane's children were educated in the finest arts and sciences of the day, and Crane's reach extended far beyond the hilltop manor. Across Allen County lay 6 additional estates, each one a jewel of comfort and luxury, each home to what Crane termed his secondary families. At Willowbrook Farm, 20 miles south of Fort Wayne, 5 wives and 16 children lived among rolling fields of corn and quiet groves of sycamore. Riverside House, a stately mansion along the St. Mary's River, sheltered 4 wives and 12 children in gracious seclusion. Every property was a private world, complete with servants, governesses, and well-appointed schoolrooms. Perhaps the most unsettling detail was how openly all of this unfolded. Crane appeared at public functions with different wives on different evenings, attended church with various combinations of children, and threw lavish parties where members of all his families mingled freely. At first, Fort Wayne society reacted with a sharp intake of breath. But curiosity soon softened into a strange kind of admiration. The Crane wives, elegantly dressed and serenely composed, seemed genuinely content. The children were unfailingly polite and astonishingly well educated. Newspaper society pages, once hesitant to print his name, began to feature glowing profiles of Crane's remarkable household, praising the charitable work of his wives and the cultural refinement of his offspring. The Fort Wayne Gazette described them as a model of modern progress, a family unbound by convention, yet orderly and prosperous in a way that soothed the public's unease. But behind the glittering parties, behind the carefully tended gardens, and the sound of children's laughter echoing through stone halls, a darker arithmetic was already at work. And in that hidden ledger, rescued by accident from fire and smoke, lay the first undeniable trace of the price that progress demanded. What secrets were written in those 3 columns of names? And how many more pages waited still hidden in the cold vaults of Indiana night? The Indianapolis Star was the first to offer its blessing. In a series of glowing interviews, several of Bartholomew Crane's older children were presented to the public as paragons of education and refinement. Their perfect diction and polite manners were praised as proof that even the most unusual household could produce shining examples of modern youth. Even the city's ministers' men, who had once thundered from their pulpits about the dangers of moral laxity, began to soften. After all, they reasoned, was it not a Christian act of charity to provide shelter and purpose to women who might otherwise remain unmarried in an age when respectable prospects were cruelly limited? Crane's arrangement, once whispered about with raised eyebrows, began to look, at least to those who benefited from his donations, like a kind of benevolent experiment. Local businessmen admired him not only for the wealth he drew from molten steel, but for the delicate diplomacy required to maintain harmony among so many strong-willed wives. At the private men's clubs, cigar smoke curling toward the ceiling, they would joke about Crane's domestic management skills, some even half serious in seeking his advice for their own far simpler marriages. Bartholomew would accept their laughter with a gracious smile and a statement he repeated often. Treat each woman as though she is the only woman in the world. He would say, his voice smooth as polished iron, and she will repay you with loyalty beyond measure. But if the surface glittered with perfection, small shadows flickered beneath. Several of Crane's wives, when cornered by curious journalists, admitted always with a quick glance over the shoulder that certain areas of the great manor were strictly forbidden to family members. They spoke of late-night deliveries arriving at odd hours, of strangers slipping through back entrances of basement doors that remained locked no matter the occasion. And when pressed for details, their smiles would falter, a brief cloud of something darker, crossing their faces before they changed the subject. The children too sometimes allowed a whisper of the hidden world to escape. 10-year-old Edmund, in a moment of careless play, told a visiting friend that his father kept a special place where bad people went to learn how to be good. 12-year-old Margaret once confided to her tutor that she heard singing, low and sad, rising from beneath the library floor late at night. Yet when adults gently asked about these comments, the children seemed to lose their memories, as though the words had been borrowed from dreams they could no longer recall. Servants less bound by family loyalty told stories that clung like smoke. Housemaids reported bloodstains on garments sent down from the restricted wings of the manor. Groundskeepers swore they had seen strange pieces of equipment, tools with no household purpose, delivered to the hidden basement doors. Kitchen staff who prepared meals for the sprawling families noticed that far more food left the kitchens than the known residents could possibly consume. Yet no official guests were ever announced. The wives themselves, though outwardly serene, revealed subtle habits of unease. They rarely traveled alone, even into nearby Fort Wayne. They avoided conversation about their lives before joining the Crane household. And most unsettling of all, not one maintained contact with a family of origin. Crane explained this with a practiced air of pity. All of his wives, he said, were orphans or estranged from relatives too narrow-minded to accept their enlightened way of life. By 1890, the public image of Bartholomew Crane, industrial genius, domestic innovator, potential governor of Indiana, seemed untouchable. Visitors traveled from as far as New York and California to marvel at his steelworks and to catch a glimpse of the legendary household where harmony reigned. Newspapers speculated about a political future for the man who claimed to have solved the eternal problems of loneliness and want by simply refusing to recognize society's limits. And yet, even as his star blazed ever brighter, quiet rumors began to drift through the poorer quarters of Fort Wayne. In the immigrant neighborhoods, in the shadowed hobo camps along the railroad tracks, people traded uneasy stories. Workers who had answered advertisements for positions at the Crane Steelworks simply vanished. Families who responded to domestic postings at the estates were never seen again. Strange figures were said to roam the city's darkest streets at night, offering wages too generous to be believable opportunities that disappeared along with those who accepted them. For a time, these stories were dismissed as the anxious inventions of the desperate, the kind of ghost tales that thrive wherever poverty meets wealth. But on a rain-soaked evening in October of 1890, the first crack in Bartholomew Crane's carefully forged empire appeared. That autumn brought a labor shortage unlike any the city had known. Fort Wayne's factories were starving for workers, and rival industrialists fought bitterly to recruit men to their furnaces. Signing bonuses soared. Wages climbed. Yet while others scrambled, the Crane Steel Works never faltered. New workers arrived as if by some private, inexhaustible source. Men appeared suddenly at the foundries, quiet, capable, and curiously content with wages that were noticeably below the city's rising standards. When fellow owners asked how he managed such effortless recruitment, Crane only smiled that same polished smile and offered a simple answer. "My reputation," he would say, "draws the finest workers from across the region." Fair treatment is its own advertisement, but late at night, as the rain hissed against the glowing windows of Crane Manor, the question lingered like a breath held too long. Where exactly were all these men coming from, and what price had they unknowingly agreed to pay? The truth, as it slowly emerged, was far more tangled and infinitely darker than any rumor whispered along the rail lines. Among those who first sensed the shape of something wrong was Thomas O'Brien, a veteran foreman at the Crane Steel Works. For 8 long years, he had overseen the endless roar of furnaces, the molten glow of steel pouring like liquid sunlight into the molds of progress. He was no stranger to hard labor or to the high turnover that came with it. And yet, something about the rhythm of Crane's workforce began to trouble him. Unlike other factories where men formed friendships over mugs of beer and shared the easy gossip of long shifts, the Crane foundry held a different cadence. Workers arrived labored with almost mechanical precision, and then, after a few weeks or months, simply vanished. No farewell drinks, no talk of better wages elsewhere. Just gone. At first, O'Brien told himself it was only the brutal nature of steel work. Men came. Men left. The furnaces never cared. But he was a careful man, and as the seasons passed, he began to keep quiet notes. Names, start dates, sudden departures. And the pattern that emerged chilled him more than the fiercest Indiana winter. It wasn't the weak or the unskilled who disappeared. Some were his most seasoned workers, immigrants from Germany and Ireland. With years of foundry experience, men eager to build permanent lives in Fort Wayne. Others were strong farm boys from nearby counties, young husbands saving for houses, fathers who had spoken with bright eyes of bringing their families to town. They were men who wanted roots, not restless wanderers, and yet they slipped away as if erased. Determined to understand, O'Brien began to search. He visited the boarding houses where these men had lived, only to find their rooms stripped, bare, trunks, emptied beds, already reassigned. At the railroad station, he inquired about tickets purchased under their names. Clerks shook their heads. No records, no departures logged. When he sought out the families of local workers, the mystery deepened. Each household had received a letter, neatly written and warm in tone, claiming that the missing man had found better prospects in a distant city and would send for his loved ones once established. The letters were full of personal details, childhood nicknames, private family jokes that should have been impossible for a stranger to know. And yet, O'Brien noticed something that others overlooked. Though the handwriting differed from letter to letter, each bore subtle, almost imperceptible similarities. Tiny flourishes of the pen, the same looping tail on certain letters as if a single hand had worn many disguises. More unsettling still, some of the letters contained intimate facts the men had shared only in private conversations with O'Brien himself. Who was listening? And how had those confidences found their way onto paper that carried no return address? His unease hardened into resolve. O'Brien began arriving at the steel works before dawn, lingering long after sunset, watching with the patient eye of a man who knows that answers hide in the quiet hours. What he saw in those black pre-dawn intervals would never leave him. Between the fading of the night shift and the arrival of the day crew, when the furnaces glowed like sleeping beasts, horse-drawn wagons crept to a rear entrance of the factory. Their drivers were wrapped in heavy coats despite the mild autumn air, their faces shadowed beneath low-brimmed hats. The wagons carried not crates of ore or barrels of coal, but people, men, women, children, figures who moved with the slow stumbling gait of the half-awake or the drugged. No words were exchanged, only curt gestures from the drivers, as the passengers were guided toward a section of the works that O'Brien had always believed to be a storage depot. Night after night, he watched. The people who entered that silent wing before dawn never emerged during daylight hours. Instead, new laborers appeared on the foundry floormen, whose faces bore little resemblance to those who had arrived in the wagons, yet who wore the same rough work clothes and carried lunch pails of identical make. Was it merely the fog of early morning? Or were these truly different men stepping into the lives of those who had gone inside? The questions gnawed at O'Brien until he could no longer remain a distant observer. On a moonless night in November, he chose to follow. At roughly 3 o'clock in the morning, he shadowed a wagon as it rolled away from the steel works, its iron wheels whispering over the damp earth. The route led not toward Fort Wayne's crowded neighborhoods, but out into the dark countryside along narrow lanes he had never traveled. Hour after hour, the wagon pressed deeper into the silence, the mist curling around its wheels like pale smoke. Finally, it turned onto a private road, a path O'Brien recognized only when the trees parted and a familiar silhouette rose against the starless sky. Crane Manor. Hidden behind a grove of ancient oaks, O'Brien crouched in the wet leaves and watched as the wagon halted beside a shadowed entrance at the base of the mansion. Lantern light flickered briefly as a heavy door swung open downward into the earth itself. One by one, the figures were led inside. The door closed. Darkness reclaimed the hill. O'Brien remained there long after the wagon departed, the night wind carrying the faint, iron-scented breath of the furnaces miles away. And as he stared at the silent house, its Gothic towers etched like black knives against the sky, a single thought rooted itself in his mind, cold and immovable. Whatever secrets the ledger contained, they were waiting here beneath Crane Manor. The cargo was not what Thomas O'Brien expected. When the wagon door swung open, he saw not hardened laborers but families. A dozen souls in all moving with the same strange, listless gait he had witnessed at the steelworks. Well-dressed women, elderly couples, children whose heads lolled as if in heavy sleep. None walked of their own accord. Each was guided or carried toward the yawning basement door of Crane Manor, like livestock too sedated to resist. Then O'Brien's breath caught. Among the figures was Catherine Mloud, the young widow who had haunted the factory gates for months begging for any word of her missing husband, a Scottish immigrant who had vanished after only a few weeks at the foundry. Catherine had spoken to O'Brien herself, frantic and determined, swearing she would never stop searching. Now she was being borne unconscious into the private estate of Bartholomew Crane. The realization struck like a furnace blast. This was no midnight recruitment of new workers. This was abduction systematic, organized, and years in the making. At dawn, O'Brien marched to the sheriff's office, clutching the truth like a live coal. Sheriff William Hendris, a heavy man with the practiced calm of long authority, listened with growing irritation rather than alarm. When O'Brien finished, the sheriff leaned back and gave a slow, disbelieving stare. "Thomas," he said at last, voice thick with warning, "you're accusing one of the most respected men in Indiana. Bartholomew Crane employs half this county. He keeps our charities alive. Are you prepared to stake your name on a story that could ruin the very man who feeds this town?" O'Brien insisted, offering to guide deputies to the factory, to the manor, to the very road where the wagons traveled under moonless skies. The sheriff's eyes hardened. He refused to authorize any search, muttering about overworked drink and wild imagination. When O'Brien pressed, Hendris threatened to jail him for public disturbance. The newspapers proved no refuge. The editor of the Fort Wayne Gazette listened politely, then shook his head. Crane's advertising paid half the paper's bills. Printing such accusations would be suicide. Every door O'Brien knocked on was barred by the same invisible lock, Crane's money. Law enforcement. The press, local politicians, even the churches were bound to the steel magnate by a web of donations and dependents. To accuse Crane was to threaten the livelihood of an entire city, but O'Brien was not the only one keeping quiet records. Across town, Sister Margaret O'Connell of the Catholic Orphanage had been compiling her own list of the missing. Over 2 years, she had received letter after letter from desperate families searching for relatives who vanished after answering employment ads on Crane properties. These were not only single men, but whole families. Mothers, fathers, children, drawn by promises of work as housekeepers, tutors, or groundskeepers. None were ever seen again. Sister Margaret tried visiting several Crane estates herself. Guards politely turned her away, claiming the families had simply moved on. When she persisted, Bartholomew Crane arrived at the orphanage in person. He came not with threats, but with a smile and a donation large enough to keep the orphanage alive for a year. His message, soft as velvet, was unmistakable. Focus on the children under your care. Stop asking questions. Faced with the survival of dozens of homeless orphans, the nun bowed to necessity. Her ledger of disappearances was tucked into a locked drawer. By the spring of 1891, a suffocating silence lay over Fort Wayne. Workers' widows, priests, editors, each one who suspected the truth, found themselves cornered by dependence and fear. The wagons kept coming, and the missing kept vanishing as if the very earth of Indiana was swallowing its people whole. The wagons continued their silent deliveries under the cloak of midnight. Bartholomew Crane's name, spoken with reverence in every church and courthouse of Fort Wayne, remained spotless. Yet, beneath the enforced calm, a pressure was building. Thomas O'Brien still haunted the dark edges of the steel works, recording each wagon, each unfamiliar face in a journal he hid beneath the loose floorboard of his boarding house room. Sister Margaret, careful as a nun, handling relics, maintained her own ledger of vanished families drawing lines and dates until a sinister pattern began to emerge. And within Crane Manor itself, the first quiet fractures had begun to appear. The women who bore the crane, name the wives who had once floated through its marble corridors with serene confidence, now walked as though the floors themselves might betray them. Voices dropped to whispers, eyes flicked toward doors that were always locked, toward wings of the house that remained forever under renovation, though no hammers ever rang. Lelanena Hartwell had been the first. Married to Bartholomew in 1878, she had watched him rise from an ambitious steelworker to one of the most powerful men in Indiana, and had watched him acquire wives the way he acquired steel mills, carefully, methodically, each new marriage a transaction of beauty and influence. Her rank as senior wife granted her privileges. She managed the household staff, oversaw the education of the children, and served as hostess for Crane's endless social obligations. It also gave her access to the books. And it was the books that first unsettled her. The monthly accounts revealed expenses that made no earthly sense. Food orders large enough to feed 3 times the household's population. Medical supplies, morphine. Chloroform surgical instruments delivered in quantities fit for a small hospital. Regular substantial payments to names she did not recognize for services rendered that were never described. When Lelanena questioned her husband, Crane would smile with polished ease. Business associates required private accommodations. A charitable clinic for his steelworkers needed quiet funding. His answers were plausible, too plausible, but none explained why these facilities never appeared in his public speeches about philanthropy. The unease sharpened as the staff began to change. Longtime servants vanished, replaced by strangers with tight smiles and restless eyes. These newcomers kept different hours, arriving before dawn and departing long after sunset, their duties confined to the forbidden wings of the mansion. And then came the sounds. Deep in the night, when the manor should have been silent, Lelanena heard the distant hum of machinery from the lower floors. Sometimes there were muffled voices speaking in languages she could not place. Sometimes, though, she tried to convince herself it was only the wind. There was the faint, unmistakable sound of weeping. Her attempts to share these fears revealed that she was not alone. Margaret Sullivan, Crane's third wife, confessed that her youngest children woke screaming from nightmares of sad people hidden inside the walls. Victoria Welsh, the fifth wife, reported that her teenage daughter had glimpsed strange faces staring from the dark windows. Of wings long declared unoccupied, the wives began to meet in secret gathering late at night in Lelanena's sitting room. Each brought fragment of unease, unexplained deliveries, sudden absences, unfamiliar figures glimpsed in hallways at dawn, foul odors seeping from locked doors. Slowly the fragments joined into a single dreadful picture. A picture of a household deliberately divided, its true purpose hidden behind charm and wealth. Then Margaret Sullivan made a discovery that turned their whispered suspicions into cold terror. While searching the library one sleepless night, she pressed against a bookshelf and felt it shift beneath her hand. A section of the case swung silently outward, revealing a narrow passageway descending into darkness. A staircase spiraled downward, far deeper than any of the wives believed the house extended. Margaret stood at the threshold, lantern, trembling in her grip, heart pounding against the hush of sleeping children above. And then, with a resolve born of fear and fury, she began to descend. The hidden staircase ended at a heavy wooden door, its surface scarred and reinforced with multiple iron locks. Margaret pressed her ear to the cold wood. What she heard on the other side stole the breath from her chest. There were voices. Not just one or two, but many men, women, even children. Some were weeping. Others coughed with the rasp of sickness. Now and then came faint pleading cries for help, so weak they barely rose above the low, relentless growl of machinery. Beneath it all pulsed a steady rhythm of metal striking metal, the unmistakable clang of a manufacturing process humming in the dark. Margaret stumbled back from the door, heart hammering. Whatever lay beyond was not a hidden storeroom or some innocent workshop. It was a place where people lived or were kept under conditions no human should endure. When she returned to the wives' secret meeting, her face pale and her lantern shaking, the others listened in stunned silence. They had feared corruption. They had whispered of secrets. But now there was proof of something far worse, living captives beneath their own home. Yet proof meant nothing without action, and action they all knew could destroy them. To accuse Bartholomew Crane was to risk everything: wealth, children, even their lives. Their private debate ended abruptly in December of 1891 when a single terrifying event made the danger undeniable. 7-year-old Timothy Crane, Elelanina's youngest, vanished one winter afternoon. One moment he was playing in the West Wing, the next he was simply gone. Servants searched every hall, every garden path. Hours passed. Panic rose like a tide. And then, as mysteriously as he had disappeared, Timothy was found asleep in his own bed, his small body limp and strangely heavy, as if he had been carried there. But the boy's return brought no comfort. His once clean clothes were streaked with grime and carried a sharp metallic odor, the same scent that clung to the forbidden corridors of the manor. His breathing was ragged, his throat raw from a sudden violent cough, symptoms that spoke of smoke or chemical fumes. When Elelanina gently questioned him, Timothy grew agitated, his wide eyes darting toward the floor as though afraid of invisible ears. He spoke haltingly of the working people downstairs of a sad place where nobody can leave. He described a vast room filled with lots and lots of people and the deafening hammering that never stopped. Then came the most chilling detail of all. Someone, Timothy said, had told him he was going to learn about the family business. But after a whispered conference, they decided he was too small to understand and returned him to his room. Elelanina felt the blood drain from her face. Her son had not wandered by accident. He had been shown the hidden world below and drugged or hypnotized to blur his memory. And whoever guarded Crane's secrets had been willing to risk harming a child, their own child, to send a message. The wives were now prisoners in every sense. They could not appeal to the law. Bartholomew's influence made the sheriff little more than a gatekeeper in his employ. They could not flee. Crane held the deeds, the accounts, and most cruelly, the legal custody of their children. And each day they lived above what they now knew to be a subterranean prison, listening to the faint hum of machinery and the ghosts of suffering drifting through the walls. Worse still, Crane himself seemed to sense the shift in their hearts. His questions grew sharper. His eyes lingered too long. He began appearing unannounced in rooms where the wives gathered, offering a polished smile that carried the weight of a warning. Servants were reassigned. New attendants shadowed the women through the house. The atmosphere inside Crane Manor thickened into a quiet terror like a storm cloud pressing down on the earth. Then, in January of 1892, Margaret Sullivan made the discovery that turned suspicion into nightmare certainty. While sweeping her bedroom, her foot caught on a loose floorboard. Beneath it lay a small wooden box. Inside was a collection of objects so intimate and so damning that Margaret felt her knees give way. Jewelry photographs, letters, small identification cards, all belonging to people she recognized from whispered stories of disappearance. Each piece told a human story, a locket engraved with initials, a pocket watch etched with a wedding date, a child's ribbon still faintly scented with lavender. Among the letters was one that froze Margaret's blood. It was addressed to Catherine M'Leod, the Scottish widow, whose frantic search for her missing husband had brought her weekly to the steelworks. The letter was her desperate plea to the Fort Wayne sheriff for help. Its date was a mere 3 weeks before Margaret herself had seen Catherine carried unconscious into the black mouth of the basement door. Margaret clutched the letter as the dreadful truth settled over her. They were not merely sharing a home with a criminal. They were living alongside a man who systematically kidnapped, imprisoned, and perhaps even murdered the innocent. The elegant mansion with its polished floors and glittering chandeliers was no home at all. It was the beating heart of a machine that preyed on the vulnerable, a place where wealth and respectability were nothing more than a mask. And yet, even this revelation was not the end. Some truths still waited in the shadows below. Truths so monstrous that the wives of Bartholomew Crane had only begun to glimpse the full depth of the darkness beneath their feet, the full scale of Crane's depravity, and the ultimate fate of those who vanished into his orbit would only come to light because one woman, a wife he believed safely subdued, decided to risk everything to expose the monster she had unknowingly married, and the nightmare that pulsed beneath her very feet. Rebecca Fleming had always been different from the other women who shared Bartholomew Crane's household. A former schoolteacher from Chicago, she had married him in 1889, drawn at first to his formidable charm and the promise of stability he offered. But unlike the others, Rebecca possessed a sharp, analytical mind and a quiet independence that had attracted Crane initially, and now made him increasingly uneasy. Were the other wives gradually surrendered to the suffocating etiquette of Crane Manor? Rebecca refused to stop asking questions. Her chance to act came in February of 1892. Crane departed for a business trip to Pittsburgh that was to last 2 full weeks. For the first time since entering the manor, Rebecca found herself with long, unsupervised hours, no husband watching her movements, no specially assigned servants shadowing her every errand. She had spent months quietly studying the house's layout, noting subtle irregularities in its architecture corridors that ended abruptly, windows that opened onto blank walls, faint drafts that whispered of unseen spaces. The mansion's original construction, completed in 1883, had been followed by a series of additions ostensibly to accommodate Crane's growing family and steel empire. But to Rebecca's eye, these renovations served a darker purpose. Her late father, an architect, had taught her to read the language of buildings, and she recognized signs of concealed corridors and hollow walls. Armed with this knowledge, she began mapping the hidden geography of Crane Manor, tracing lines of construction that seemed to extend below the earth itself. Before dawn, one cold February morning, Rebecca followed the narrow passage Margaret Sullivan had first discovered behind the library bookshelf. She descended the steep staircase to the heavy bolted door at its base. Instead of forcing the locks, she slipped into a secondary corridor she had recently identified, an older service tunnel disguised behind a wine cabinet. The air grew damp and metallic as she crept downward, lantern in hand, through a maze of stone corridors that twisted deeper beneath the house. What she finally reached was not a simple cellar but a subterranean labyrinth, a hidden complex sprawling far beyond the visible footprint of the mansion. Room after room opened before her, each more unsettling than the last. This was no storage basement. It was an underground factory. Rebecca stood frozen as the clang of machinery echoed through the chambers. Furnaces glowed dimly in the distance. Sparks leapt from grinding wheels. The ore reeked of coal smoke, hot metal, and something sharper, an acrid tang she would later recognize as burning bone. And there were people. Dozens of men, women, and even children labored in these suffocating rooms, chained to workstations where they fed roaring furnaces and hammered glowing metal. They moved with mechanical precision, their eyes dull with exhaustion and laudanum. The gaunt faces revealed every shade of Fort Wayne's missing population: immigrant families, itinerant workers, beggars who had simply vanished from the streets, and even familiar townsfolk believed to have left for opportunities elsewhere. They worked 18 to 20 hours at a stretch, sleeping only in brief drugged intervals on filthy straw pallets. Food was scarce air, barely breathable. Guardsmen Rebecca recognized as Crane's private security moved silently among them, carrying batons and hypodermic needles. The prisoners were kept compliant through beating, starvation, and regular doses of a heavy sedative that dulled their senses and erased their memories. Rebecca understood with horrifying clarity what she was witnessing. This was the engine of Bartholomew Crane's fortune. While rival steel magnates struggled with labor strikes and rising wages, Crane had solved the problem by creating a workforce that could never leave, never demand, pay, never speak. His celebrated steel products, those that had made him the pride of the Midwest, were forged by stolen lives. Yet even this monstrous revelation paled before the final chamber she entered. At the farthest edge of the complex, a furnace roared hotter than any meant for steel. Its purpose became undeniable as Rebecca saw the grisly remains stacked beside it. Bones, charred black ash, sifted into barrels. The dead workers, too sick or broken to continue, were not buried or released. They were burned, and Crane, in an act of perverse ingenuity, had turned even their deaths into profit. The mineral residue of human bone, rich in calcium and phosphates, was mixed into the steel itself. This additive, she realized, accounted for the baffling superiority of Crane's products: steel stronger, lighter, and more resilient than that of any competitor. Every beam, every rail, every shining blade that bore the Crane Steel Works name contained the very bodies of the people who had made it. Rebecca staggered back, nearly dropping her lantern. The walls themselves seemed to breathe with the heat of the furnace, as though the house were alive, feeding on the endless cycle of capture labor and annihilation. Somewhere above, her fellow wives and innocent children slept in their velvet-draped bedrooms, unaware that beneath their feet a factory of death clanged on through the night. Rebecca knew then that discovery meant certain death, but silence meant complicity. And if she faltered, no one outside Crane Manor would ever know the terrible price of the steel that was building America's future. The confrontation unfolded inside Crane's private study, a chamber of polished mahogany and quiet menace. The room had always projected wealth and legitimacy, rows of law books, shelves of neatly bound contracts, the faint scent of expensive tobacco. Tonight, it felt like a trap. Rebecca waited until the house was silent, the servants dismissed and the other wives asleep. Her heart hammered as she tapped softly on the heavy oak door. "Come in." Crane called his voice, smooth, almost casual. She stepped inside. Bartholomew Crane sat behind his massive desk, a spread of letters and business documents before him. He looked up with a pleasant curiosity, as though she were there to discuss the day's menus. "Bartholomew," she said, forcing her voice to stay level. "We need to talk about the basement of this house." He blinked, polite confusion flickering across his face. "The basement, I'm afraid I don't understand." "Storage rooms, wine cellars, nothing that should trouble you, my dear." Rebecca met his gaze without flinching. "I've seen them," she said quietly. "The prisoners, the machinery, the furnace where you burn their bodies. I know about the kidnappings. I know how you make your steel." For an instant the mask remained in place. Then it slipped. The pleasant warmth drained from his features, leaving eyes like cold glass. When he spoke, the tone was flat stripped of all humanity. "You've been a very busy woman during my absence," he murmured. "I underestimated your curiosity. That was a mistake I won't make again." A tremor of terror passed through her, but Rebecca stood her ground. "Those people have families searching for them," she pressed. "Children who wonder why their parents never came home. You have to release them, Bartholomew. End this before it destroys everyone." Crane leaned back in his chair, studying her as though she were a stubborn ledger entry. "I'm afraid that isn't possible," he said evenly. "They serve a necessary function. They solve problems, labor shortages, inefficiency, the instability of strikes. To release them would be counterproductive." The clinical phrasing chilled her more than any threat could. "They're human beings," Rebecca said, her voice breaking with urgency. "Not tools, not raw materials. They have souls. They have dreams. You can't. Hope and dreams." Crane interrupted softly, "are luxuries that interfere with productivity. Love is a weakness that distracts from purpose. I have simply removed those inefficiencies from my workforce. My steel speaks for itself." Rebecca saw then that she was not confronting a misguided man, but something colder, a mind that had methodically erased the idea of human worth. "You won't get away with this," she said, shifting tactics. "People will notice. Investigators will come. The federal authorities aren't in your pocket. When they do, you'll lose everything: your business, your reputation, your freedom. Is it worth that risk?" A thin smile curved his lips, empty of warmth. "The authorities here are well compensated for their discretion. My associates profit handsomely from my success, and the people I select..." His eyes narrowed with quiet pride. "They are chosen because no one will come for them. Immigrants, drifters, families without ties. I have operated for 5 years without interference. Why should that change now? The casual way he listed his victims, like items in a ledger, turned her stomach. This was no man who had drifted into crime. This was a strategist who had engineered an empire of suffering. I won't be part of this, Rebecca said, her voice rising. I'm leaving this house tonight. I'll go to federal authorities. I'll make certain the world knows what you are. Crane's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted, an almost imperceptible tightening, like a predator preparing to strike. I'm afraid that won't be possible, he said softly. You've seen too much, learned too much. I can't allow you to leave with that knowledge. A cold wave of panic swept through her. For one foolish moment, she had believed that marriage offered some shield, that even a monster would hesitate to harm the woman he called wife. Now she understood love meant nothing to Bartholomew Crane. She was as expendable as the laborers beneath their feet. The other wives know, she blurted, desperate to buy time. Eleanor, Margaret, Victoria. They know everything I've discovered. If anything happens to me, they'll go to the authorities. Crane regarded her with the same clinical detachment he might show a defective piece of machinery. He paused, considering. That is unfortunate, he said at last. I had hoped to avoid complications with the rest of my family. But if they have become liabilities? His eyes settled on her like a closing vice. Then adjustments will have to be made. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the faint ticking of the mantel clock, a sound suddenly as ominous as the machinery grinding in the depths below. Rebecca realized with terrifying clarity that every second she remained in that room was a second borrowed against death. The meaning of his words struck Rebecca like a physical blow. He was not only threatening her, he was calculating the murder of his other wives, perhaps even his own children, if that was what it took to protect the empire of pain and profit buried beneath Crane Manor. The man she had married was no mere criminal. He was something far colder, something that would extinguish any life, any innocence, to keep his machinery running. Rebecca's only hope was escape. If she could reach the outside world, reach anyone beyond Bartholomew Crane's reach, perhaps the prisoners in the hidden chambers still had a chance. But even as the thought formed, she turned toward the study door and felt the first chill of hopelessness. 2 men stood waiting in the doorway. Their clothes were rough like common factory workers, but their eyes carried the watchful precision of trained guards. Rebecca had never seen them before. Crane's voice followed, calm and cold as a winter blade. Rebecca, he said smoothly, allow me to introduce 2 of my most trusted associates. They'll help you relocate to a quieter part of the house, somewhere you'll be more comfortable. We can continue our discussion there without interruption. Relocate. The word was a mask for imprisonment, and discussion could only mean interrogation. For a heartbeat, despair nearly swallowed her whole. Perhaps it would be easier to surrender, to let the nightmare swallow her and hope for mercy. But mercy was a fantasy, and somewhere beneath her feet, men, women, and children labored and wept in darkness. If she failed, more would vanish. More would die. A sudden, desperate resolve burned through her terror. Before the guards could close the distance, Rebecca lunged for the study window. If she could shatter the glass shout into the night, someone, anyone, might hear. but the guards moved with brutal efficiency. Their hands clamped onto her arms, dragging her back before her fingers even brushed the curtains. They seized her, twisting her arms until pain flashed white behind her eyes. Yet even in that agony, her mind remained sharp. Hidden deep within the folds of her skirt was a precious bundle, the map she had drawn of the underground passages. The list of names she had overheard whispered in the dark, and the notes describing every machine, every chamber, every stolen soul. As the men forced her toward the door, she managed a final defiant gesture. With a quick motion, one so small it might have seemed accidental, she let the documents slip from her grasp. They fell soundlessly into the narrow gap behind Crane's heavy desk, disappearing from sight. Neither Crane nor his guards noticed. Those pages, damp with her sweat and trembling determination, would remain hidden for months, waiting for the day when someone would find them and tear away the mask of respectability that cloaked America's most celebrated family man. The guards dragged her from the study down the hushed corridors that smelled faintly of polish and steel. Behind her, she could hear Crane's voice, low measured, already issuing instructions. Plans were being set in motion. Plans that would not stop with her capture. The nightmare that had begun with kidnapped strangers was now reaching inward toward Crane's own household. The transformation of Crane Manor from a grand home into a fortress of terror happened with terrifying speed. By morning, the wives awoke to find the estate under quiet siege. Armed men stood at key doorways and along the grand staircases. They claimed to be security hired because of vague threats against the family. But their watchful eyes and ready weapons told the wives what words did not. No one was leaving. Elena Hartwell, the senior wife, tried to ask about Rebecca. Where was she? Was she ill? Had she gone to town? The guards answered with polite but unyielding lies. Mrs. Fleming has taken suddenly ill, they said. She is receiving treatment in a private facility. Questions are not advisable. It was enough to still the room. Every wife understood the true message, do not ask again. From that day forward, the grand house that once hosted glittering parties became a silent prison. The wives were restricted to carefully chosen rooms. Their letters were intercepted before leaving the property. Servants who once smiled and gossiped now moved stiffly eyes, averted as if fearing punishment for a single misplaced glance. Worst of all, the children were taken from their mothers under the pretense of special tutoring. In truth, they were hostages living insurance for their mother's obedience. And Bartholomew Crane, the charming husband who had once dazzled society with his warm manner and polished speeches, was gone. In his place stood a figure of icy calculation, his eyes flat and unreadable. When he spoke to his wives at all, his words carried the quiet finality of a warden addressing prisoners. Their comfort, he explained, depended entirely on their silence. Their lives and the lives of their children rested on their willingness to forget everything they had seen, everything they might still suspect about the empire that pulsed and smoked beneath the floors of Crane Manor. The air inside Crane Manor thickened into something almost physical, a damp, breathless tension that clung to every wall and whispered through every hallway. It was not just fear anymore. It was the sound of fear. At night, the wives began to notice noises rising from the depths below. Faint at first, like a door groaning on rusted hinges, then unmistakable long, unbroken screams that seemed to stretch across entire hours. There were harsh metallic clanks, the grinding of machinery forced to its limits, and an occasional rhythmic pounding that suggested new tunnels being carved into the earth. Was he expanding the darkness beneath their feet? The thought alone made sleep impossible. Even as Crane tightened his grip on his household and the silent empire beneath it, something beyond his reach had begun to stir. Forces he could not charm, bribe, or threaten were quietly moving toward Fort Wayne. Too many people had vanished for too many years. The pattern could no longer be disguised as accidents or wandering souls. Far away, Special Agent Daniel Kowalski of the newly formed Bureau of Investigation sat hunched over a desk littered with maps and reports. He traced the black pins that marked the missing, following their slow, dreadful drift toward a single point in Indiana. Unlike the local officials, men whose pockets were already lined with Crane's money, Kowalski recognized the unmistakable outline of a machine built for human suffering. Could one man truly command an enterprise so vast? Every instinct in him whispered yes. The letter that started his inquiry came from a trembling hand, Sister Margaret O'Connell. She had lived too long with her fear, but at last her conscience overpowered her terror. Her account was precise: families who vanished overnight, carefully kept records of names that never reappeared. Other cities echoed the same lament. It was enough to place the matter firmly under federal jurisdiction. Then came Thomas O'Brien, the steel works foreman. For months he had watched strange deliveries to the manor and recorded every shadow in a leather-bound journal. His testimony added weight, but it was the quiet arrival of Dr. Harrison Peaton that tipped the balance. The doctor had treated workers from Crane's factories, men and women, with injuries that spoke of confinement, malnutrition, even subtle chemical poisoning. How could so many share the same hidden afflictions? When Peaton heard of the federal probe, he surrendered his medical records, cold proof of a system that treated flesh as raw material. By March 15, 1892, the evidence could no longer be denied. Before dawn, federal agents and soldiers from Fort Benjamin Harrison surrounded Crane Manor like a tightening noose. Every door, every window was sealed. Inside, Bartholomew Crane sat in his study methodically feeding papers into the flames. He looked almost serene, as if destruction were merely another business transaction. When agents burst in, he offered only a thin smile, a man who believed even now that his power could not be touched. What the search revealed would haunt hardened investigators for the rest of their lives. The underground complex sprawled beneath the manor like a second hidden city. Tunnels led to chambers of forced labor, to cages stacked like coffins, to furnaces built for more than iron. Veteran agents, men who had seen war and murder, turned pale and stumbled back from the heat of those fire pits. Some retched where they stood. The rescue unfolded like a grim miracle. Doctors, nurses, and interpreters flooded the estate to tend to victims pulled from the earth. Many stared blankly, unable to comprehend that the nightmare was ending. Others, thin as ghosts, collapsed in the arms of their rescuers before a single word could be spoken. Among them was Rebecca Fleming. 3 weeks of darkness had not broken her. She clung to the faint hope that someone somehow would piece together the clues she had left behind. When agents pried open the gap behind Crane's desk, they found her hidden map, the careful diagrams of tunnels, the list of names, the proof of an empire built on human agony. Rebecca's testimony, joined with the evidence she had risked her life to protect, laid bare the full scope of Crane's reign. 5 years, 400 souls stolen. Less than 100 brought back to the light. The rest lost to exhaustion disease machinery or the cold efficiency of murder when their usefulness ended. Even in a nation already hardened by frontier violence, the trial of Bartholomew Crane transfixed the public. Newspapers called it the reckoning of a celebrated family man, but those who had walked the tunnels knew better. It was a reckoning for something far older and far darker than any headline could capture. And as the courtroom filled with the voices of the rescued one, question lingered like a restless shadow. How many more manners, how many more charming patriarchs still hid such empires beneath their floors, waiting only for someone brave enough to listen to the screams in the dark? The trial of Bartholomew Crane, or Bartholomew Ukraine, as the papers sometimes called him, unfolded like the final act of a nightmare. Day after day, the courthouse filled with faces that had once been shadow survivors who carried the quiet weight of basement darkness. Federal agents hardened by discovery and ordinary citizens who had never imagined such evil could take root behind the manicured hedges of Fort Wayne. The evidence was merciless. Dozens of survivors took the stand, their voices trembling but unbroken as they described the machinery of suffering hidden beneath the manor. Agents presented crates of physical proof instruments of confinement ledgers written in Crane's own careful hand, blueprints of tunnels that should never have existed. Each page revealed not just isolated crimes, but a methodical attempt to treat human beings as if they were nothing more than replaceable cogs in an industrial machine. Crane's defense tried one last desperate argument: insanity. Surely, they claimed, no rational mind could conceive such a vast architecture of cruelty. But the prosecution laid out a different truth: the schedules, the budgets, the precision of a man who calculated suffering with the same cold efficiency he once applied to steel production. It was planning, not madness, that had built the empire below. The jury needed less than 2 hours. When they returned, the words "guilty" on all counts carried a hush across the room like a sudden winter wind. Bartholomew Crane met the verdict with the faintest tilt of his head, a man more irritated than shaken. Even on the morning of his execution, November 3, 1892, in the yard of the Indiana State Prison, he offered no apology, no plea for mercy. Instead, he left only a single chilling remark that his methods would one day be recognized as contributions to industrial efficiency. Imagine believing that progress could be built on the bones of the innocent. For the women and children who had lived above the tunnels, freedom brought its own heavy burden. Though none were charged, they carried the lifelong shadow of having unknowingly shared a roof with one of the worst criminals in American history. Ellen Hartwell, once the senior wife, quietly changed her name and disappeared into another state, seeking a life where no one would recognize her face. Others scattered like seeds on the wind, trying to outdistance the whispers that would forever follow the name Crane. And Rebecca Fleming, the woman whose quiet courage had set the investigation in motion, chose a different path. She never remarried. Instead, she dedicated the remainder of her days to the work of rescue and reform, becoming an advocate for victims of kidnapping and a trusted advisor to federal investigators. To her, the lives lost beneath the manor could not simply be mourned. They demanded action. The physical symbols of Crane's empire did not survive him. The Crane steel works was shuttered, its forges cooled and silent. The great manor, once the pride of Fort Wayne society, was demolished by federal order. In its place grew a memorial garden. Stone markers rose from the earth like quiet sentinels, each carved with the name of a life stolen by greed and cruelty. Visitors still walk there, reading the engraved names, listening to the wind through the trees, and wondering how such horror once hid behind polished windows and Sunday smiles. The case changed more than the families it scarred. It reshaped the nation's understanding of organized crime and industrial abuse. New federal laws emerged, laws to protect workers, to punish kidnappers, to give the Bureau of Investigation sharper tools to pierce the armor of wealth and respectability. But perhaps the greatest lesson was more human than legal. It was the recognition that evil often dresses in the trappings of success. A celebrated steel magnate, a devoted father in the public eye, could mask a heart that viewed people as mere raw material. The legacy of Bartholomew Crane still lingers in quiet ways. It lingers in the vigilance of investigators who refuse to be dazzled by wealth. It lingers in the courage of ordinary people like Rebecca Fleming, Thomas O'Brien, and Sister Margaret O'Connell, who risked everything to bring hidden truths into the light. Their bravery reminds us that even in an age of prosperity and glittering progress, the darkest cruelty can bloom in the shadows of respectability. And so, as you drift into the hush of night, ask yourself, how many more facades still conceal unspeakable things? How many more polite smiles hide the quiet machinery of harm? History tells us that monsters rarely look like monsters. They often look like neighbors or pillars of the community until someone dares to listen to the faint cries beneath the floorboards. What do you think of this story? Could such a web of cruelty still grow unnoticed today? Perhaps the answer lies in our willingness to see and to speak when silence seems safer. If this tale kept you company tonight, stay with us for more stories where history whispers its darkest secrets. Until next time, may your dreams be peaceful and your ears always open to the truths the world tries to hide.